He was the most feared man on the East Coast, and the night someone finally broke him, the only person who refused to walk away was a woman he never expected to love. What happens when a mafia boss who ruled through fear discovers that the one thing he cannot control is the way one woman looks at him? Not with terror, not with pity, but with something far more dangerous. If you've been waiting for a story that will tear your heart open and put it back together differently, you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe now so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every word of this matters. No. The rain came down like it had a grudge. It hit the windows of the Voss estate in hard, flat sheets, the kind of rain that didn't bother with atmosphere. It just arrived, relentless and cold, the way bad news always does. Inside, the main study sat in near total darkness. The lamps had been switched off hours ago. The fireplace had been allowed to die down to nothing but gray ash and a few stubborn orange coals that refused to quit. The room smelled like expensive bourbon, old leather, and something underneath both of those things. Something medicinal and sharp that no amount of money could fully cover. Adrian Voss sat in the center of the room in his wheelchair and stared at the wall. Not at anything on the wall, just at the wall itself. The blank plaster. The shadow the dying fire threw across it. He'd been sitting that way since 6 in the evening, and the clock on the mantel now read 10:15. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't spoken to anyone. His housekeeper, Mrs. Galen, had knocked twice. Once with dinner, once with a message from his second-in-command, Rourke, and both times Adrian had said nothing until she finally went away. He was good at making people go away. He'd spent 37 years becoming the best in the world at exactly that. The wheelchair was a Permobil M3, matte black, custom fitted to his frame. It had cost more than most people earned in a year. It was, by every measurable standard, an exceptional piece of engineering. Adrian hated it with a depth that surprised even him. Not because of what it was, because of what it meant. Because every morning when he woke up and reached for the edge of the bed and remembered that the reaching was the easy part, that the standing wasn't coming, that the man who had once walked into rooms and watched every head turn was now someone who got wheeled. Every morning that memory hit him like a fresh wound. 6 months since Damien Crow's men caught his motorcade on the Whitmore Bridge. 6 months since the ambush, the screaming metal, the shots. The way he'd felt the impact not as pain but as a sudden total erasure. Like someone had reached into his spine and simply switched something off. He'd survived. 3 of his men hadn't. He told himself it was guilt that kept him awake at night. It was easier to call it that. The truth was harder to look at directly. The truth was that Adrian Voss, who had built an empire on the absolute certainty of his own dominance, was now confronting the one enemy he had never prepared for. A version of himself he didn't recognize. He reached for the glass of bourbon on the side table. His hand was steady. It was always steady. That was one thing the wheelchair hadn't taken from him. And he drank without tasting it. Somewhere in the mansion, a door opened. He heard voices. Rourke's low, steady rumble. Someone else, higher, female, arguing. He heard Rourke say something clipped and final, the way Rourke always talked when he was done with a conversation. Then silence. Then, 30 seconds later, knocking at the study door. Not the polite knock of Mrs. Galen, harder, impatient. "Mr. Voss," Rourke's voice through the door. "There's a woman at the gate. She's been there for 2 hours. She won't leave." Adrian didn't answer. "She's soaked through. Gate security offered to call her a car. She refused. She says..." A pause. Rourke sounded like a man choosing words carefully, which was unusual for him. "She says she's not leaving until you let her in. She says you know her." The fire popped. A coal shifted and broke apart. "Send her away," Adrian said. His voice came out lower than he intended, rougher. Like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time. "We tried, sir. 3 times. She brought flowers." Adrian closed his eyes. He knew who it was. "Send her away, Rourke." The silence on the other side of the door lasted long enough that Adrian thought he'd gone. Then, "It's raining hard, sir. If she stays out there much longer." "I heard what I said." Another silence. Then footsteps moving away. Adrian sat with his bourbon and his dying fire in the rain against the glass, and he thought about Elena Whitmore the way he'd been trying very hard not to think about her for the past 6 months. She had dark hair that she wore pulled back when she was working, and loose when she thought nobody was watching. She was built the way women used to be built in paintings. Substantial, present, taking up real space in the world. And she'd spent 32 years being made to feel apologetic about it by a world with bad taste and worse instincts. She laughed easily, cried without embarrassment, and had a habit when she was listening carefully to someone of tilting her head slightly to the left like a bird trying to hear something faint and far away. He'd noticed that the second Tuesday he visited her shop. He'd told himself it was nothing. Told himself he was simply a man who needed to buy flowers for his sister's grave and happened to have chosen a convenient location. He told himself that for approximately 14 weeks before he admitted, in the private courtroom of his own mind, that he was lying. She had been the one steady thing. In a life built on controlled chaos, on leverage and threat, and the management of dangerous men, Elena Whitmore's small flower shop on Hartley Street had been the one place where nothing was required of him. She never asked questions. She never flinched. She looked at him. Not at his suit, not at the men who waited outside on the sidewalk, not at the reputation that arrived before him in every room. She looked at him, at his face, with a kind of uncomplicated attention that he found deeply, almost painfully disorienting. He'd watched her once from across the street. A homeless man had come into the shop, old, smelling of the street, pockets empty. Adrian had watched Elena give him a small bunch of yellow flowers. Daisies, he thought, without hesitation, without theater, without any of the self-congratulatory performance that usually accompanied public generosity. She'd just given them, smiled at the man, gone back to trimming stems. Adrian had stood on the sidewalk in his $1,500 shoes and felt something shift in his chest that he had no vocabulary for. That was the moment, if he was being honest. That was the one. But honesty had its limits, and those limits had been reached the night Damien Crow showed him exactly how exposed he'd become. "You have a weakness," Crow had said, 2 days before the ambush. A message delivered through channels. Everyone does. The difference between you and other men is that yours has a name. Adrian had known, hearing that he'd made a catastrophic error. Not falling in love, he could live with that. What he couldn't live with was having let it show. So he'd done what he knew how to do. He'd closed everything down. After the hospital, after the surgeries and the prognosis and the word permanent, delivered by a soft-spoken neurosurgeon who had the decency to look him in the eye while he said it. After all of that, Adrian had issued one instruction regarding Elena Whitmore. She doesn't come near me. She doesn't get messages. She doesn't know anything except that it's over. He told Rourke to handle it. He didn't ask how. What he hadn't accounted for was Elena. He heard the front door of the mansion open. He heard Rourke's voice again, in the entrance hall, and then, cutting through it, clear and unhesitating, a woman's voice that said, "I know he told you to send me away. I'm going to need you to take me to him anyway." Adrian set down his bourbon. The footsteps crossed the entrance hall. They came down the corridor. They stopped outside the study door, and this time there was no knock. The door opened. She stood in the doorway, soaked to the skin. Her dark hair was plastered to her face. Her coat, a green one, wool, completely wrong for this weather, hung heavy with water. She was holding a paper-wrapped bundle of white lilies against her chest like she was protecting them from the rain, which she obviously had been, because they were the only dry thing about her. Her eyes found him immediately, across the dark room, and she didn't recoil. She didn't make the face he'd been bracing for, the involuntary flinch of pity that he'd seen on others, the split-second recalibration people did when they saw the chair and realized they needed to reorganize their understanding of who he was now. Elena just looked at him, steady, like she'd been rehearsing for this moment for 6 months because she had been. "You're soaking wet," Adrian said. It came out accusatory. "Yes." She stepped inside. "Because I've been standing in the rain for 2 hours waiting for you to stop being stubborn." "I told Rourke. I know what you told Rourke." She crossed the room, set the lilies on his side table next to the bourbon, and then stood in front of him with her wet coat dripping on his very expensive Persian rug. "I also know that you've lost about 15 pounds. You haven't been sleeping, And the last time you returned anyone's calls was 3 weeks ago. I know because I've been keeping track through people who actually answer their phones. You've been asking about me. Obsessively. She said it without shame. Are you going to offer me something hot to drink, or are we going to stand here while I ruin your rug? He looked at her for a long moment. The fire had almost nothing left. The room was dark and cold and smelled like medicine and isolation, and she was standing in the middle of it, dripping rainwater, refusing to look at him with anything other than that direct, infuriating steadiness. You shouldn't be here, he said. His voice had gone somewhere strange, somewhere he didn't want it to go. You keep saying things you don't mean, Elena said. It's becoming a pattern. He moved to the side table and pressed the intercom. Mrs. Galin, tea, 2 cups. He released the button, looked back at Elena. Sit down. You'll catch something. She sat in the armchair closest to the dead fire, peeled off her coat, and draped it over the back. Underneath, she wore a cream-colored sweater, soaked at the shoulders. She didn't look uncomfortable. She looked like a woman who had made her decision and was done second-guessing it. How did you find out? Adrian asked. About the chair. Your man Torres told me. 3 weeks ago. He felt guilty. She paused. He should. 6 months, Adrian. 6 months of nothing. I protected you. You disappeared. That's the same thing. She shook her head slowly. It really isn't. He rolled the wheelchair to the window. Outside, the rain continued its assault on the grounds. He could see the gate lights in the distance, the security detail moving through the weather. His empire, still running, still operational, still generating fear and revenue and compliance in equal measure. All of it continuing without him in the way it always had, because he'd built it that way, engineered it to function without visible dependence on any single person, including himself. He had thought that would feel like foresight. It mostly felt like loneliness. You have no idea what it cost, he said quietly. Letting you in then, whatever that was. Whatever I let happen, you have no idea what that kind of exposure costs in my world. I know exactly what it cost. Her voice was level. I watched the news, Adrian. I know what happened on the Whitmore Bridge. I know 3 men died. I know why. He turned the chair to face her. Then you know why you need to leave. I know why you think I need to leave. She met his eyes. That's different. Mrs. Galen brought the tea. She set it on the low table between them without a word. The woman had an extraordinary instinct for reading rooms, and disappeared. Adrian watched Elena wrap both hands around the cup, the way people do when they are cold all the way through and trying to pull warmth from whatever source is available. He thought about how long she'd stood at his gate in the rain. 2 hours. The thing about Elena Whitmore, the thing he'd tried for 6 months to rationalize away, to reframe as sentiment, as weakness, as a temporary loss of clarity, was that she was the only person in his adult life who had ever shown up without wanting something. Not information, not access, not protection or money or the reflected status of standing next to a powerful man. She showed up because she wanted him, and the obscenity of that, the sheer improbability of it, given everything he was and everything he'd done, had never fully left him. I'm not the same, he said. The words cost him something. He could feel it. What you knew, whatever version of me you thought you... I knew you were lonely, Elena said. I knew you were carrying something enormous and carrying it alone because you didn't know another way. I knew you were kinder than you let people see. She looked at him directly. None of that changed because you're in a wheelchair, Adrian. The only thing that changed is that you added broken to the list of things you've decided to carry alone. And I'm here to tell you that you don't have to. The rain hit the windows. The last coal in the fireplace went dark. He sat in his chair in the dark of his study and looked at the woman who had stood in his rain for 2 hours with a bundle of white lilies pressed against her chest. And he felt something he had spent 6 months trying to cauterize. He hadn't quite managed it. Stay tonight, he said. It came out rougher than he intended. It's late. The roads are... I'll stay. She didn't make him finish the sentence. He nodded, looked away. Out the window at the dark, wet grounds. Damien Crowe isn't finished, he said quietly. Not a confession, more like a fact being laid on the table between them, the way you'd set down a weapon you were done pretending you weren't carrying. The ambush was the first move. His people went quiet after, but that's what Crow does. He waits. He finds the thing you didn't think to protect. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then, he already found it. Yes. And it didn't work. Not yet. The word landed in the room. Yet. He watched her process it. Watched her face go through something, some internal reckoning, and come out the other side still steady. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked. He looked at her. Outside, somewhere on the estate's perimeter, one of the security lights flickered, then went out. Adrian's hand moved to the side table before he was fully conscious of reaching. An old instinct, muscle memory from a life spent in rooms where darkness meant danger. His phone was in his hand. His eyes were on the window. "Adrian." "Quiet." His voice had changed. Entirely. The man who'd been sitting in the dark drinking bourbon and talking about feelings was gone, replaced by something older and colder and absolutely certain of what it was doing. He was already thumbing through to Rourke's number. "Get away from the window. Now." Elena stood. She moved without argument. Something in his voice had communicated itself completely. His phone connected. "Rourke." Static. Then Rourke's voice, low and taut. "We have a problem on the east perimeter, sir. Cameras went dark 30 seconds ago. We've got—" The sound of glass breaking somewhere in the east wing cut through the call. Adrian Voss looked at Elena across the dark room, and for one moment, just one, he let himself look at her the way he'd been refusing to look at her for 6 months. Then he pressed the button on his chair's arm panel that Rourke had installed 3 weeks ago. The one that transmitted a single encrypted signal to every operative on the estate grounds. Black Shield Protocol. The one command that meant everything else stopped and one mission began. "Stay close to me," he told her. "Don't move unless I tell you to move. Do you understand?" She looked at him steadily. "Yes," Elena said. And from somewhere deep in the east wing of the Voss estate, in the middle of a rainstorm on a Thursday night in October, the war that had been waiting for 6 months finally arrived. The east wing went quiet first. That was the thing that made Rourke's stomach drop. Not the breaking glass, not the cameras cutting out, but the silence that followed. In his 17 years working for Adrian Voss, Rourke had learned to read the estate the way sailors read water. Certain sounds meant certain things, and sudden silence, after a breach, meant the men who should have been shouting weren't able to anymore. He was moving through the main corridor with 2 of his best, Carver and a newer man named Spade, when his earpiece crackled. "East corridor, 2 down." The voice belonged to a guard named Petrov. It was controlled but thin. "I've got eyes on at least 4 hostiles. They're not rushing. They know the layout." Rourke pressed himself against the corridor wall and clicked twice. Acknowledgement, no words. His mind was already running the geometry of the estate. The east wing contained the old dining room, the wine cellar access, 3 unused guest suites, and the secondary server room where Adrian kept encrypted backup communications. That last one mattered. Anyone who knew to go for it knew too much. His phone buzzed. "Adrian." "Sit rep," Adrian said. No greeting. The old voice, the one that had nothing in it except command. 4 confirmed hostiles in the east wing, possibly more. They're moving deliberately, not fast. This isn't a smash job, sir. This is a search. A beat of silence. They want the server room. That's my read. Lock it down remotely, code 7. Already done. Rourke checked the corner. Clear. Ms. Whitmore is with me. Focus. The line went dead. Rourke looked at Carver, who was 42 years old, built like a man who'd spent his 20s in places where the rules were different, and who communicated primarily through facial expressions that Rourke had learned to read like a second language. Carver's current expression said, "This is going to be ugly." Rourke agreed. They moved. In the study, Adrian had already positioned Elena against the interior wall. The one with no windows, no exterior exposure, the wall he'd mentally cataloged 3 months ago when Rourke had first started walking him through the estate's vulnerability points. That conversation had felt theoretical at the time. It did not feel theoretical now. He had a gun in his lap. a Sig Sauer P226 matte finish kept in the locked drawer of his side table for exactly this category of evening. Elena had seen it without comment, which told him something about her. Either she'd prepared herself for this possibility, or she was better at managing shock than most. He suspected both. "How many?" she asked. She was standing with her back flat against the wall, arms loose at her sides, not hyperventilating, not crumbling. Her wet hair was drying in pieces around her face, and she looked— he registered this with some distant, inappropriate part of his brain— absolutely nothing like a woman who was terrified, even though she had to be. "Unknown. At least 4. Is this Crow?" "It's Crow's people." He was watching the door, the window, running calculations. "He won't come himself. He never does." "Coward." "Smart," Adrian corrected. "Crow's a lot of things. Stupid isn't one of them." He checked the gun's chamber from habit, snapped it shut. "This isn't random. They let themselves get seen on the perimeter. They knew we'd scramble the interior team east. That's a distraction." Elena went very still. "For what?" He looked at her then. Not the quick functional look he'd been giving her since she walked in. This was longer, and it cost him something to hold it. Because the answer to her question was her. The distraction was for her, and she could see from his face that he knew it, and she could see him deciding whether to say it, and she watched him decide against it, which meant she already knew. "We need to move you," he said. "Where?" "There's a room off the main basement. Reinforced door, no exterior walls, independent ventilation. We use it for—" He stopped, started again. "It's secure. A panic room. I don't call it that. Because the name bothers you, or because you've never had to use it?" "Because I built it for guests," he said, which was partially true and mostly a deflection she saw through immediately. She didn't push it. That was another thing about her. She knew when to let something go, which was a skill that most people in his life had never developed. "All right," she said, "let's go." He moved the chair to the door, listened, cracked it open 2 inches. The corridor was dark. The estate's emergency lighting had kicked in, casting everything in a low amber glow that made familiar architecture look strange and hostile. He could hear Rourke's team somewhere in the East Wing, voices clipped and tactical, a sound he'd lived inside for years. It should have been reassuring. Something about tonight was making it hard to find reassurance anywhere. They went left. Adrian knew every inch of this corridor. He'd spent 3 months relearning the estate from wheel height, relearning distances and surfaces and the precise weight of every door. That knowledge, which he'd acquired in bitterness and necessity, was suddenly the most useful thing he had. He moved quickly and quietly, Elena's hand on his shoulder at his instruction. Not because he needed the contact, but because he needed to know where she was at every second. They made it to the stairwell access door. He stopped. The basement required stairs. 12 steps, a landing, 8 more. He'd never attempted them in the chair. There was a lift at the far end of the building, installed when the estate was first built, but the far end of the building was across 60 feet of main corridor and required passing the entrance to the East Wing. He sat with this problem for exactly 3 seconds. "There's a lift," he said. "East side." "How far?" "Too far tonight." Elena looked at the stairwell door, looked at him. He watched her doing the math and coming to the same conclusion, and he watched something move through her face that wasn't pity. He'd become expert at identifying pity, had developed a kind of rage sensor for it. This was something else, something that looked like problem solving. "Can you manage stairs?" she asked. Straight. No softening, no apology in the question. He held her gaze. "I haven't tried." "Okay?" She said it like it was an answer, not a judgment. "Then we figure it out." "Elena, the door's reinforced, right? The basement room." "Yes." "Then that's where we're going." She opened the stairwell door, looked down the stairs. "Tell me what you need me to do." He wanted to argue. He felt the argument sitting in his chest, the automatic refusal, the one he'd constructed around himself like a fortification these past 6 months. The wall that said, "I don't need help, I don't accept help," I was not built to accept help. He felt it rising. He let it go. Take the chair down first, he said. Fold it. The lever on the left side. Set it at the bottom. Then come back. She was already moving. She had the chair folded in 30 seconds. She'd been watching how it worked, he realized, since she came in, quietly cataloging the mechanics of it without being asked. She carried it down the stairs with both hands, set it at the bottom, came back. He'd already shifted his weight to the top step, sitting, both hands on the handrail. It was going to be ugly. He knew that going in. It was ugly. He went down on his hands and the flat of his forearms and the considerable strength of his upper body, 12 steps, and then a landing and 8 more. And it took 4 minutes and cost him something in his shoulders and his pride. And Elena stayed 1 step below him the entire way without touching him, without offering assistance he hadn't asked for, just present, just there. A warm and steady human body between him and the drop. When he reached the bottom and got himself back into the chair, he was breathing hard. He didn't look at her immediately. She didn't comment. She just said, "Which direction?" He pointed. They moved. The basement was low-ceilinged and smelled like stone and old iron and the slight chemical sharpness of the HVAC system. The reinforced room was at the far end, behind a door that looked like it belonged on a vault. Adrian keyed the code, 6 digits, changed monthly, and the bolts drew back. Inside, a cot, a folding table, water, a first aid kit, a tablet loaded with encrypted communication channels, and a single overhead light. Functional, spare, designed for waiting. Elena looked at it the way a person looks at a place they're going to have to accept. "Stay here," he said. "Lock the door behind me. The code to open from inside is..." "You're not staying." "No." She turned to face him. The light in the room was harsh and direct, and it showed everything. The water still drying in her hair, the tightness around her eyes, the way she'd set her jaw in a particular way he'd cataloged over a year of Tuesday mornings. "This is what he wanted," she said. "Whoever's up there. They wanted you separated from your people." "I'm not separated. You're alone in a basement room with me." Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it. "Is that better or worse than what they planned?" He looked at her. She was right. That was the thing about Elena. She was right with a regularity that he found simultaneously frustrating and necessary, like a compass that worked even when you didn't want to know which direction north was. "I need to be in communication with Rourke," he said. "Use the tablet. I need to be visible to my people. In a situation like this, my people need to see that you're not hiding." She said it quietly. Not an accusation, just the thing he was struggling to say. "Yes." She held his gaze. "Then go." She crossed to the door. "But Adrian." He stopped. She was holding the door open, one hand on the thick reinforced steel, and she looked at him with that direct steadiness that had demolished every defense he'd built in 37 years. "Come back." It was 2 words. The most uncomplicated 2 words anyone had said to him in his adult life. He'd had men swear him oaths, had received loyalty pledges from people who would have broken them 6 different ways by morning, had been told he was feared and respected and necessary by people who measured those words by what they could get in return. Nobody had ever just said, "Come back." "Lock the door," he said. He went back up the stairs the same ugly way he'd come down, and by the time he reached the main floor, the estate had gone completely silent, in the way that meant the first part was over and the second part hadn't started yet. Rourke was waiting in the corridor. He had a cut above his left eye that he hadn't bothered to deal with, and his jacket was torn at the shoulder. Carver was beside him. Spade was not. "Where's Spade?" Adrian asked. Rourke's jaw tightened. "East wing. He's stable. Took one in the calf." "The hostiles?" "3 down. 1 runner. We lost him at the east perimeter wall." Rourke crouched down so he was at eye level. Something he'd started doing after the ambush without being asked, and which Adrian had never commented on. "Sir, the server room was the secondary target." Adrian went cold. "What was the primary?" Rourke reached into his jacket and produced a phone in an evidence bag. Cheap burner, cracked screen. "Found it in the east corridor. It was transmitting. They had a live feed from inside the estate." "From where?" "We're still tracing." Rourke's voice was careful. "But the angle on the feed, the room it was pointing at..." He stopped. "Say it." "It was the study, sir, before the lights went out. Before Ms. Whitmore arrived. He paused. They knew she was coming. The corridor was very quiet. Adrian felt something settle through him. Not panic, not the hot spike of fear, but something colder and more permanent. The kind of feeling that came when a situation clarified itself completely, and what was clarified was very bad. They hadn't come for the servers. They'd come to confirm Elena was in the building. "Get me Crow's current location," Adrian said. His voice was doing the thing it did when everything else shut down. "And get me Marcus." Rourke hesitated. "Marcus has been retired for 2 years, sir. He's in... I know where he is. Get him on a secure line. Tonight." He turned the chair toward the corridor. "And pull the camera feeds from the last 72 hours. Every camera, inside and out." "What are we looking for?" "How they knew her schedule." He stopped, didn't turn around. "Someone told them when she'd be here, Rourke. Someone in this building or someone close to it." The silence that followed had a specific quality to it, the quality of a room where everyone is suddenly aware that trust has become expensive. "I'll start the pull," Rourke said quietly. By 2 in the morning, they had the cameras, and by 2:40, they had the answer. And the answer was the kind that sat in the chest like swallowed glass. The feed had been planted 6 days ago. A device no larger than a coat button pressed into the baseboard trim beneath the study's secondary window by someone who had legitimate access to the estate. Someone who came and went without triggering security protocols. Someone on the interior staff. Mrs. Galen had been with Adrian for 11 years. She was 63 years old. She had a daughter in Portland and a photograph of the coast on her desk in the service quarters, and she made the best coffee of anyone Adrian had ever known. And she had been feeding Damian Crow information about the estate for, based on the technical metadata Rourke's man pulled from the device, at least 4 months. 4 months. Since before the ambush. Possibly since before Crow's men went to the bridge. Rourke brought him the data at the kitchen table, spread it in front of him on a laptop screen, and let him look at it without speaking. Adrian sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the evidence for a long time. "Where is she now?" he said finally. "Her quarters. Asleep, as far as we can tell." "She doesn't know we found it." "No." Adrian looked at the screen. 11 years. The woman had made him coffee every morning for 11 years, had known exactly how he took it, had navigated his moods and his silences and his controlled rages with the calm efficiency of someone who understood difficult men. He thought about every conversation he'd had in that study, every phone call, every meeting where the door was closed but not locked because Mrs. Galen had always been trusted without question. He thought about what Crow had done with that access. He thought about Elena, standing in the rain for 2 hours at the gate. "Don't wake her," he said. "Post someone outside her door, quietly. I want her contained until morning." "And then?" He closed the laptop. "And then she and I are going to have a conversation." He went back to the basement at 3 in the morning. He knocked 3 times, then twice, the pattern he'd told Elena to listen for, and heard the bolts draw back. And when the door opened, she was standing there with the tablet in her hand and dark circles under her eyes, and a quality of alertness that told him she hadn't slept. She looked at his face and read it immediately. "What happened?" she said. He came inside. The door closed behind him. The room was small and the light was still harsh, and he looked at her across the folding table and thought about all the ways he should have protected her better. All the months he'd spent pushing her away thinking that distance was protection. All the ways he'd been wrong about the geometry of danger. "We found the source of the leak," he said. She sat down on the cot. She didn't ask who, which told him she'd already been running the possibilities in her head, down there in the basement by herself, the way smart people do when they're alone with a problem and nothing else to occupy them. "Someone inside," she said. "Yes." "Someone you trusted?" "Yes." She looked at her hands, then at him. "How long?" 4 months, maybe longer. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Adrian, the night of the ambush, the timeline is consistent with her access." He said it flat. There was no other way to say it. Elena pressed her fingers to her mouth briefly. Not in dramatics, just in the gesture of a person absorbing something that genuinely hurts. "She let them know I was coming tonight." "Yes." They came for me. The servers were the cover story. They wanted visual confirmation that you were in the building. He kept his voice level. And then, I think, they wanted to see what I'd do. She looked up sharply. They wanted to see if you'd leave me. He held her gaze. They wanted to know if you were still a leverage point, or whether I'd managed to cut you loose like I claimed. He paused. We gave them an answer tonight. The air in the small room settled. Outside, somewhere above them, he could hear the estate continuing its operational response. Footsteps, the occasional muffled voice, the system doing what it was built to do. Down here, it was just him and Elena and the overhead light and the truth of what they were both facing now. So what happens now? Elena asked. Her voice was steady. That steadiness, he thought. It wasn't the absence of fear. It was fear held in both hands and refused permission to run the show. He looked at her. She deserved the truth. He'd been giving her managed information for too long, making decisions about what she could handle the way men did when they confused protection with condescension, and she'd never asked him to do that. She'd never asked him for anything except the basic respect of being treated like someone who could bear weight. Now Crow knows exactly where we are, he said. He knows you're here. He knows I'm not going to send you away. And he knows... He stopped. What? He knows it worked. Whatever he was trying to do to me when he ordered that attack on the bridge, putting me in this chair, taking away the thing I spent my whole life believing I was, he knows it didn't finish me. He watched her face. Which means he's going to try something else. Elena's jaw worked. She blinked once, slowly. Then she said, he's going to try to take me. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Adrian Voss looked at Elena Whitmore in the spare, harsh light of the basement room, and for the first time since the Whitmore Bridge, he felt fear the way he had not felt it in decades. Not the manageable, tactical kind, the kind you work with and plan around, but the older kind, the kind that has a face on it, the kind that is specifically and precisely terrified of losing one particular thing. He had spent 6 months believing that distance was armor, that if he removed her from his life completely, Crow would lose interest, would find a different lever, would move on to the next calculation. He understood now, with the cold clarity of 2 in the morning and 11 years of misplaced trust, that he had been catastrophically wrong. Damien Crow was not going to move on. He was already moving. And somewhere in this city, in whatever room Crow occupied while other men did his violence for him, he was looking at whatever his people had transmitted from the study before the power went out, looking at the image of Elena Whitmore walking through the door of the Voss estate with white lilies pressed against her chest, and he was smiling because the picture had told him everything he needed to know. Adrian reached across the table and took Elena's hand. She looked down at it, looked up at him. I need you to do something, he said, and I need you to do it without arguing. She studied his face. Whatever she found there made her go very still. What? She said. Tomorrow morning, he said. You're going to leave this estate as if everything is normal. Elena didn't argue. That was the thing that kept Adrian awake the rest of that night. Not the breach, not Mrs. Galen, not the cold geometry of what Crow was planning. It was the fact that Elena had listened to his instructions, asked 3 precise clarifying questions, and then said all right in a voice that told him she understood the plan and trusted it, and was afraid, and was going to do it anyway. He wasn't used to that. He was used to negotiation, to pushback, to people who agreed with him because they were afraid not to. Elena had agreed because she believed him, and the difference between those 2 things was the difference between a transaction and something he didn't have clean words for. She left at 7:15 in the morning. Rourke drove her in a car that was not one of the estate's usual vehicles. A civilian sedan, gray, registered to a shell company that had no visible connection to the Voss organization. Elena wore different clothes, borrowed from the estate's emergency supplies, and she carried nothing that had come in with her the night before. She looked, pulling away from the east gate, like a woman going home from a visit. Unremarkable. Forgettable. Adrian watched from the study window until the car was gone. Then he turned to the room. Mrs. Galen was sitting in the armchair closest to the fireplace. She was fully dressed, hair done, hands in her lap. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for a conversation she'd known was coming for a long time and had decided to meet it dressed. Rourke stood by the door. Carver was in the corridor outside. Adrian crossed the room and stopped in front of her. He didn't speak immediately. He'd learned a long time ago that silence was the most effective interrogation tool in most situations. Not because it was clever, but because most people couldn't tolerate it and would fill it with the truth before they decided to. Mrs. Galen looked at him steadily. Her hands stayed still in her lap. 11 years, he said. She blinked. Yes. When did he approach you? Her chin moved slightly, not quite a flinch. 14 months ago. 14 months. Before the ambush, before the bridge, before 3 of his men went home in boxes. He kept his face still. What did he offer you? She looked at the fireplace. The ash from last night was still in it. Nobody had been in to clean it yet. My daughter, she said. In Portland. She has a husband who borrowed money from people he shouldn't have borrowed from. Crow's people. A pause. They were going to hurt her. Adrian said nothing. I know what you're going to say, Mrs. Galen said. She looked at him directly, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite defiance and not quite shame. Something between the two, something that had been living there a long time. I know there are things I should have done instead. I know. She stopped. She's my daughter. The fire had nothing left. The room was cold. What did you tell him? Adrian said. Specifically, everything. She told him. It took 20 minutes. She spoke in a flat, recitative voice, the way people speak when they have rehearsed a confession so many times in the privacy of their own conscience that saying it aloud has become a kind of relief. She told him about the device in the baseboard. She hadn't planted it herself. She'd let a man in through the service entrance at 4 in the morning, a man Crow had sent, while Adrian was at his monthly medical appointment in the city. She told him about the information she'd relayed verbally, Adrian's daily schedule, the layout of the security rotations, which guards had what authority. She told him about the phone calls she'd made, 3 of them, to a number she memorized and then destroyed. She told him that she had known, before she made the first call, that she was ending something that could not be repaired. When she was done, Adrian sat with it for a moment. The night of the ambush, he said, the motorcade route. Mrs. Galen's hands, which had been still the entire time, moved slightly, pressed together. Yes, she said. The word was very small. It was also the answer that changed the shape of everything he'd been holding for 6 months. The grief and the rage and the guilt about his men and the neurosurgeon's voice saying permanent, all of it reorganizing itself around that one small word. 3 men were dead because a 63-year-old woman with a photograph of the coast on her desk had been told her daughter would be hurt if she didn't make a phone call. He understood it completely. He also couldn't forgive it. Rourke, he said. Sir? Take her to the East Guest Suite. Lock it from the outside. He looked at Mrs. Galen. Your daughter is not going to be hurt. I'll see to it personally. You have my word on that, for whatever it's worth to you now. She looked at him. Her eyes had gone wet, though nothing had spilled. It's worth a great deal, she said quietly. He turned the chair to the window. I can't let you go, he said. You understand that? Yes, she said. He heard Rourke move, heard Mrs. Galen stand, heard the quiet displacement of 2 people leaving a room. The door closed. Adrian sat at the window and watched the gray October morning and thought about the fact that Crow had been inside his house for 14 months, that the coffee he drank every morning had been made by a pair of hands that were also simultaneously dismantling everything he'd built. Crow was better at this than he'd given him credit for. He needed to revise every assumption he'd made about the man. He called Rourke back in 20 minutes later. Marcus, he said. I reached him at 6. He's driving up from Anniston. Should be here by... Rourke checked his watch. Noon, maybe 1. Good. Adrian turned from the window. And the decoy? In place. Car 2 went south toward the city on schedule, matching the route Miss Whitmore usually takes back to Hartley Street. Crow's surveillance will pick it up. How long before they figure out it's a decoy? Rourke's face did the thing it did when he was about to say something that wasn't good news. Depends on how close their people are. If they're watching the shop, he stopped. Say it. If they're already watching the shop, they'll know within the hour that she's not in the car we sent. Adrian absorbed this. And the safe house? Ready, Nolan Street, clean, no connection to us. She needs to be moved there tonight, not tomorrow, tonight. Understood. And Rourke? The other man waited. Find out how many other people in this building Crow has spoken to. I want everyone's financials pulled. Everyone. Carver, Petrov, the kitchen staff, the grounds team, everyone. Rourke was quiet for a beat. That's going to create tension. Good. Tension keeps people honest. He turned back to the window. Go. Marcus arrived at 12:47. He was 61 years old, short, and built like a man who had once been considerably larger and had burned the excess away through 20 years of methodical, disciplined living. He had gray at his temples and very light eyes, and the particular quality of stillness that certain men develop when they have spent long periods of time in situations where moving unnecessarily gets people killed. He'd worked for Adrian for 9 years and retired 2 years ago to a house in Anniston with a woodworking shop and a wife named Carol who made very good soup. He came into the study, took the chair across from Adrian, and looked at him without any of the adjustment period that most people required. You look like hell, Marcus said. Thank you for coming. I told Carol it was a fishing trip. He looked around the room, the ash, the bourbon glass, the lilies on the side table that nobody had moved. What do you need? Adrian told him. All of it. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was his way. He compiled information the way other people compiled evidence, building a picture before he made any comment on what it meant. When Adrian finished, Marcus leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Crow's running a slow collapse, Marcus said. He's not trying to take your territory. He doesn't want your business. No. He wants to finish what he started on the bridge. Marcus looked at him. He wants you to watch him take everything that matters and then decide what's left. The woman. The woman. Yes. Marcus laced his fingers across his knee. He'll move on her within 48 hours. If he hasn't already. Adrian felt something in his chest contract. Rourke has a decoy running. A decoy buys time. It doesn't buy much. Marcus paused. Where is she actually? En route to a safe house on Nolan. Marcus went still in a specific way, not the comfortable stillness of a man thinking, the other kind, the kind that precedes bad news. What? Adrian said. Marcus reached into his jacket and put a phone on the table between them. Adrian's own phone. He'd left it charging in the corridor. This came through on your main line while I was waiting in the hall. Rourke didn't want to interrupt your briefing. He paused. I think you need to see it. Adrian picked up the phone. It was a photograph. Elena, on a sidewalk. Taken from a distance, slightly blurred, but the subject was unmistakable. Dark hair, green coat, the particular quality of the way she stood. The timestamp on the photograph was 43 minutes ago. Beneath the photograph, a message from an unknown number. She never made it to Nolan. Try again. The room went absolutely silent. Adrian stared at the photograph. His thumb moved across the screen and brought up the contact he needed, and he pressed call before he was fully conscious of having decided to, and it rang, and rang, and rang, and went to voicemail, and the voicemail was Elena's voice saying she wasn't available and to please leave a message, and he hung up and called again and got the same thing. He called Rourke. Rourke answered on the first ring. The car on Nolan, Adrian said. His voice had gone somewhere very quiet. Check in with the driver. A pause. Keyboards. Movement. Then Rourke's voice, doing something Adrian had never heard it do before. Something that sounded like it was working very hard to stay level. The car checked in at 11:42. It should have reached Nolan at 12:05. Another pause. Sir, I'm not getting a response from the driver. Send someone to the route, now, every intersection between here and Nolan. Already moving. And pull Crow's known properties within a 20-mile radius, everything, old safe houses, businesses, properties held under any name he's ever used. That's going to take, do it faster than it takes. He hung up. Marcus was watching him from across the table. He hadn't moved. His expression was the expression of a man who has seen catastrophic situations before and knows that the next 60 seconds are going to determine how the next 60 hours go. "She's not at the safe house," Adrian said. It wasn't a question. "No." "And Crow's people had her location before she got there." "Looks that way." Adrian set the phone down on the table, precisely, with the specific care of a man who needs his hands to do something deliberate because the alternative is not deliberate at all. He looked at his hands, then he looked at Marcus. "Mrs. Galan told them," he said. "She couldn't have. We contained her at 6 this morning. The car left at 7:15. Marcus looked at him steadily. "Then someone else knew the Nolan address." The sentence settled over the room like weather. Adrian ran through it. Who had known about Nolan Street? He'd told Rourke. Rourke had arranged it, which meant someone in Rourke's operational chain. The driver. Whoever had prepared the house. Whoever had sourced it. He thought about what he'd said to Rourke that morning. "I want everyone's financials pulled." He thought about the fact that he'd said it an hour after the car left. An hour too late. He got Rourke back on the line. "The Nolan address?" he said. "Who knew it besides you?" Rourke's answer came back after a silence of about 4 seconds. 4 seconds that told Adrian that Rourke was either checking or already knew and was deciding how to say it. "Carver sourced the property," Rourke said. "He has a contact in the rental market. Clean, usually. He's used the contact 3 times in the past 2 years without... Is Carver there?" "He's on the east perimeter." "Bring him in." "Sir." "Now, Rourke." He looked at Marcus while he waited. Marcus looked back. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing useful to say. The architecture of betrayal had its own grammar, its own rhythm, and both of them had been in this world long enough to recognize it. The way it unfolded, layer by layer, each new revelation opening beneath the last one like a series of trapdoors with no bottom. Carver came in 8 minutes later. He was built the way he'd always been built. Solid, deliberate, a man whose body communicated competence. He'd been with the organization for 11 years, same as Mrs. Galen. He'd taken a bullet in Lyon in 2019, covering a retreat that Adrian had ordered. He had a scar on his left forearm and a daughter named Ruth, who was 6 years old, and who he talked about in the specific, helpless way that men talk about children they would do anything for. He came into the study and read the room in approximately 3 seconds, and Adrian watched him do it, watched him take in Adrian's face, Marcus across the table, the quality of the silence, and he watched Carver's body make the microscopic adjustments that bodies make when the situation has been understood and the understanding is bad. "Sit down," Adrian said. Carver sat. "The Nolan address," Adrian said. "You sourced it." "Yes." "Who did you tell?" Carver's jaw worked once. "The contact who arranged the property. Standard protocol." "Who is the contact?" A pause. Very brief. The kind of pause that a man with practice at maintaining composure produces when he needs a fraction of a second to decide something. "A rental broker. Name of Hewson." "I've used him." "I know who Hewson is." Adrian looked at him steadily. "I know because I had Rourke pull your financials this morning, and Hewson's name appears in your personal accounts 3 times in the last year, each time following a significant deposit. And Hewson has a business relationship with a property management company that shares a registered agent with 2 of Damien Crow's known shell entities." The room was very still. Carver looked at him. He didn't look away. Adrian had to give him that. "Lyon," Adrian said. "You took a bullet in Lyon." "Yes." "Was that real?" Something moved across Carver's face. Something that might have been genuine pain. "That was real," he said. "I swear to you that was real." "Then when?" Carver looked at his hands in his lap, then back up. 8 months ago, he said. "Crow's people found Ruth's mother. She'd taken the girl and left. I didn't know where they were. Crow knew. He showed me a photograph." He stopped. "Ruth was in it." Adrian looked at him for a long time. He thought about what it cost to be a man in his world. The specific tax of it, the way it reached past you and into the people you loved, used their faces as instruments of leverage, turned your capacity for love into your most precise and reliable vulnerability. He'd built his entire life around the project of not having that vulnerability. He'd kept people at distance, kept his heart behind several layers of operational discipline, and it had worked for years until a Tuesday morning in a flower shop on Hartley Street when a woman gave a stranger a free flower and he'd been standing across the street watching. Everyone in his world had a Ruth. He was looking at Elena's photograph on his phone. "Where is she?" he said. His voice was flat, and it cost him a great deal to keep it flat. "Elena, where did Crow's people take her?" Carver looked at him. "I don't know the address. I passed the route information to Houston. That's all I knew." "You knew enough." "Yes." The word came out like something that had been sitting on the man's chest for months and had finally been set down. "Yes, I did." Adrian turned to Marcus. "Houston." "I'll find him within the hour," Marcus said. He was already standing. "Don't bring him in. Follow him. Wherever he goes in the next 3 hours, that's where Crow is operating." Marcus left. Adrian sat in the study with Carver across from him, and the ash in the fireplace, and the white lilies slowly opening in the morning light. And he thought about Elena in a room somewhere, with Crow's people, and he thought about what Crow intended to do with her and how long he intended to take doing it. And he made himself think about it clearly, because clarity was the only weapon he had that hadn't been taken from him. He looked at Carver. "Ruth," he said. "Where is she now?" "I'm going to find out," Adrian said. "And when I do, I'm going to make sure she's somewhere Crow can't reach. Both of them." He paused. "After that, you and I will have a longer conversation about what comes next. But right now I need everything you know about how Houston communicates with Crow's people. Every channel, every protocol, every name you've heard." Carver stared at him. "Why?" he said. Not challenging, genuinely confused, like a man who had been preparing for one outcome for a very long time and was having difficulty processing the arrival of a different one. "Because the woman Crow has taken," Adrian said, "has never done anything to deserve what's being done to her. And because I am going to get her back." He held Carver's gaze. "And because I need every person in this building who still has a reason to function to be functional right now, including you." He paused. "So tell me what you know." The debrief took 40 minutes. Carver knew more than he thought he knew. Details absorbed passively, the kind of information that accumulates without intention when you're adjacent to an operation. Names. A location in the warehouse district that Houston had mentioned once in passing. The specific time window that Crow's people preferred for moving assets. The phrase assets landing in Adrian's chest like a shard of something sharp. Elena was an asset now. In Crow's accounting, that was what she was. The phone rang at 3:17 in the afternoon. Unknown number. Adrian answered it. "Adrian Voss?" The voice was smooth, accented with the particular flatness of a man from the mid-Atlantic coast who had spent years trying to sand the origin out of it. Damien Crow. In person, finally. Not through intermediaries, not through messages, not through devices planted in baseboards. Himself. "Crow," Adrian said. "I wanted to call personally," Crow said. "As a courtesy, given the history." A pause. "She's fine. I want you to know that. She's completely unharmed. I'm not an animal." "Tell me what you want." "What I've always wanted." Another pause. "Step away. From all of it. The organization, the territories, the accounts. Everything transferred cleanly and completely to my oversight within 72 hours. You retire. You go somewhere. You take the woman if she still wants to go with you." A brief silence. "Or she stays here, and you continue to be a problem. And what happens after that is entirely your doing." Adrian looked at the window. The gray October afternoon. His estate, his grounds, his men moving through it, still operational, still his. He thought about stepping away. He turned the idea over the way you turn something in your hands to look at it from every angle. A life outside this. Elena, safe. Himself, diminished, absent, removed from consequence. It was a version of the future that existed, technically, that could be walked toward. He also thought about what Crow would do with the organization once he had it. The people under Adrian's protection, the ones who had arrangements, guarantees, the specific understood order of things that Adrian had maintained for years, because chaos was bad for everyone, including him. He thought about what Crow's version of that order looked like. He'd seen it in the territories where Crow already operated. He knew what it cost. 72 hours, Adrian said. 72 hours, Crow confirmed. I'll be in touch with transfer details. A pause. There was something in the pause, something almost regretful, if Crow was capable of regret, which Adrian doubted. I didn't want it to come to this. You know that. No, Adrian said. You wanted it to come to exactly this. You planned it this way from the beginning. Silence. 72 hours, Adrian. The line went dead. Adrian sat with the dead phone in his hand and looked at the white lilies on the side table and thought with complete, terrible clarity about what the next 72 hours required of him. And what it required was something he had never done before. Something that went against every operational instinct he'd built across decades of functioning in a world where admitting limitation was a death sentence. He needed help. Not the help of men who worked for him. Not organizational capacity or operational resources or the loyalty of people on his payroll. He needed the kind of help that came from a different direction entirely, from the part of the world he'd kept at arm's length his entire life, because it operated on principles he'd never trusted. He pressed the intercom. Rourke, get me the district attorney's office, not through channels, direct. I need a name and I need it in the next 10 minutes. The intercom was silent for a beat. Sir? Rourke's voice had a quality in it that Adrian had heard precisely once before, in Lyon, in 2019, when the situation had clarified itself into something that required a fundamental change in approach. You're sure? Adrian Voss looked at the phone in his hand, at the deadline where Damien Crow's voice had been, at the 72 hours between now and whatever came next. Make the call, he said. The district attorney's name was Petra Vance. She was 54 years old, had been in the office for 11 years, and had spent 9 of those 11 years building a case against Damien Crow that kept collapsing at the foundation because witnesses disappeared or changed their minds or developed sudden convenient memory failures 3 days before testimony. Adrian knew her by reputation, precise, relentless, personally offended by Crow in a way that went beyond professional obligation, the way certain prosecutors get when a case becomes a referendum on whether the law means anything at all. He also knew she had a file on Adrian Voss that was approximately 4 inches thick. She arrived at the estate at 6 in the evening with 1 aide and no recording equipment, which told him she understood the nature of what this meeting was. She was a compact woman with silver-streaked hair, worn short, and the particular quality of composure that people develop when they spend years in rooms where composure is the only advantage they have. She looked at the wheelchair without adjustment, sat across from him, put her hands flat on the table. You have 72 hours, she said. No greeting. Less now, 68. She nodded. Then let's not use them badly. She opened a folder. Paper, not digital. Old habit or deliberate caution or both. What are you offering? Everything on Crow. Financial structure, operational hierarchy, the shell company network, the names of every municipal official he's paid in the last 6 years. He paused. The name of the man who planned the logistics of the Whitmore Bridge ambush. That one's going to be interesting to you. Vance's expression didn't change. And in exchange, Lena Whitmore gets out of whatever room Crow has her in tonight. Tonight. Not after processing, not after a task force assembles, not after you've had time to build something airtight. He looked at her. She gets out first. That's not how immunity negotiations... I'm not negotiating immunity, Adrian said. I don't care about immunity. I care about one woman who is in a room right now because of me, and I want her out of it before Crow decides his 72 hours doesn't need to be honored. He held Vance's gaze. Everything I have on Crow, every document, every account, every name, you'll be able to take him apart completely and permanently. That's what I'm offering. What I'm asking for is that you move tonight. Vance looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her aide, a young man who had not spoken since entering the room and who had the expression of someone trying very hard to be invisible. She looked back at Adrian. "Where is she?" Vance asked. "I have a location. Warehouse district. Houston. A broker Crow uses as a cutout. Was followed there 40 minutes ago. You've been surveilling the location. I have people watching from 2 blocks. They haven't moved in. Because you need me. Because moving in without legal cover in the next 48 hours destroys every case you'd build afterward and hands Crow an exit." He let that settle. "I'm offering you a clean takedown, but it has to start tonight, and it has to start with her." Vance tapped the folder once, closed it. "I need to make 2 calls. Room's yours." She stood, moved to the far end of the study, and made her calls in a low voice with her back to the room. Adrian watched the window. The October night had settled fully. No rain tonight, just cold, the kind of dry cold that made everything feel precise and final. He thought about Elena in a warehouse. He thought about what she was doing right now, in whatever room she was in. Whether she was afraid, whether she was holding herself together the way she held herself together in the basement, with that particular quality of fear that refused to run the show. He thought about her saying, "Come back." Vance returned to the table. "I have a tactical unit that can be staged 2 blocks from the location within 90 minutes. I need the specific address and whatever your surveillance has on interior layout." "You'll have it." "And Voss?" She met his eyes. "If this goes wrong, if your people are inside that building when my unit arrives, if there's a competing operation running, if one of your men fires a weapon at one of my people are watching from 2 blocks, that's all." He paused. "This is your operation, Vance. I'm giving you the target. What happens inside that building is yours." She studied him. "You're staying here." It wasn't a question, it was a requirement. He looked at her steadily. "I'm staying here." He was lying. He'd made the decision somewhere between Carver's debrief and Crow's phone call, and he'd kept it out of his face and out of his voice because the decision was not negotiable with anyone, including himself. And the only way to execute it cleanly was for Vance to believe she was running a unilateral operation while Adrian's people provided intelligence support from a distance. That was not what was going to happen. He got Rourke alone at 7:15. "The unit stages in 90 minutes, Adrian said. "We move in 60. Rourke looked at him. His face did several things in the space of 2 seconds. Then it settled. "How many?" "You, Marcus Petrov, if his leg is functional. Me." "Sir, I'm not asking your opinion, Rourke. I'm telling you the composition of the team." "You're telling me you're going into a hostile warehouse in a wheelchair." "I'm telling you I'm going in." He held Rourke's gaze. "She's in there because of me. That's not a reason to stay behind. It's the only reason that matters." Rourke was quiet for a long time, long enough that Adrian thought he was going to argue again. Then Rourke looked at the floor, looked up, and said, "The ground floor approach from the south side is the cleanest, loading dock. Surveillance shows 2 guards on rotation, gap of 4 minutes between passes." "That's our window." "Petrov's functional enough. He'll complain, but he'll be there." Rourke paused. "Marcus is already pulling the interior layout from city records. It's a converted cold storage facility, steel floors, which is going to be—" He stopped, looked at the chair. "A problem," Adrian said. "The wheels are going to make noise on steel. Then we go in during the window, and we go in fast, and noise becomes irrelevant." He looked at Rourke. "Get the team ready." He went to change clothes. Not the dressed-down civilian wear he'd been living in for 6 months. He put on dark tactical pants, boots. There was still some utility in boots, even when your feet weren't weight-bearing, and a jacket that was heavy enough to contain a sidearm without printing. He sat in front of the mirror in his bedroom and looked at himself for approximately 15 seconds. He didn't do it for sentiment, he did it to take stock, to see what he was working with. A man in a wheelchair, 49 years old, upper body strength that hadn't diminished because it was the one physical capacity he'd been willing to build during the months of recovery. A Sig Sauer in the shoulder holster. Enough residual authority in his face and his voice that most men, when confronted with them in close quarters, still found themselves adjusting their behavior without knowing why. It would have to be enough. They went at 8:40. The car was a black SUV, Rourke driving, Marcus in the passenger seat, Petrov in the back with Adrian, and a face that communicated ongoing displeasure about the state of his calf, but no inclination to be anywhere else. They drove without headlights for the last 4 blocks, navigating by the ambient light of the warehouse district. The yellow glow of sodium lamps, the distant lights of the port, the specific darkness between buildings that Adrian had learned in a very different context to read. The loading dock was on the south side, exactly as Rourke had said. The guards were on rotation exactly as surveillance had described. They watched from the car for 2 minutes, confirming the pattern, and then they moved on the 4-minute gap. The dock's rolling door was locked with a padlock that Marcus dealt with in 45 seconds using tools that Adrian had stopped asking questions about years ago. They went inside. Cold storage. Converted. The floors were indeed steel. Adrian felt the wheels find the surface and knew immediately that the sound was going to be an issue on anything but the rubber matting that ran along the central corridor. He moved onto the matting. The sound dropped. He looked at Rourke, who gave him a minimal nod. They went through the building the way they'd done it 100 times in different configurations over the years. Rourke on point, Marcus covering the rear, Petrov on Adrian's left with an expression of intense concentration that was managing whatever his leg was telling him. The interior was a maze of old refrigeration units, repurposed as storage for what appeared to be legitimate industrial equipment. The kind of cover that told Adrian that Crow used this space regularly and maintained it carefully. The voices reached them before the room did. 2 voices. One of them Adrian didn't recognize. Male, local, unhurried. The other one he recognized instantly, and the recognition went through him like electricity, and like relief, and like something else that he didn't have time to examine. Elena's voice, clipped and contained, the way she'd been in the basement, arguing about something. He touched Rourke's arm. Rourke stopped. They all stopped. "Don't need anything," Elena was saying. Her voice was close, behind a door 20 feet ahead. "And I'm not going to keep answering questions just because you keep asking them." "Ms. Whitmore," the other voice, male, patient, the patience of someone being paid to wait. "Mr. Crow just wants to know." "I know what Mr. Crow wants to know. The answer is the same as it was an hour ago. I'm a florist. I sell flowers. Whatever you think I know about Adrian Voss, you can go ahead and recalibrate, because the sum total of what I know about his business is absolutely nothing." "You were in his house last night." "I was in his study drinking tea." A pause. "He makes bad tea, incidentally. You can tell him I said that." Adrian looked at Rourke. Rourke's mouth did something that, under different circumstances, might have been the beginning of a smile. There were 2 guards on the door. Rourke and Petrov handled them in 11 seconds. Not clean, not elegant, but fast and effective, and quiet enough that the voice inside the room continued its conversation for another 4 seconds, before trailing off at some sound it couldn't identify. Rourke tried the door, locked. He looked at Adrian. Adrian knocked. 3 times. Pause. Twice. The silence on the other side of the door was about 2 seconds long. Then Elena's voice, closer now, right at the door. "Adrian?" Not a question. "Step back from the door," he said. She stepped back. Rourke put his shoulder into it, and the lock gave on the second attempt, and the door opened into a room that was small and fluorescent lit and contained a folding chair, a water bottle, a man with a phone who was scrambling to his feet, and Elena Whitmore standing in the middle of it with her arms at her sides, and a bruise developing on her left cheekbone that she clearly had not had when she left the estate that morning. Adrian looked at the bruise. Something happened in his chest that was very old and very cold. The man with the phone raised his hands immediately when he saw Rourke. Petrov moved him to the wall. Adrian crossed the room to Elena, and she looked at him, and then she did something he hadn't expected. She laughed very briefly, the short, compressed laugh of someone releasing pressure that has been building for hours. "You came yourself," she said. "Yes." She looked at the chair, at him, at the chair again, at the look on his face. "Your plan was for me to leave normally so I'd be safe," she said. and then you came into a hostile building. But the plan had a secondary component. The secondary component was you in a warehouse. The secondary component, he said, was getting you out. He looked at her cheek. The bruise was darkening at the edges, which meant it was fresh. His jaw tightened. Who? The man who brought me in. She read his face. He's not here. He left an hour ago. I'll find him. Adrian. She touched his arm. Her hand was steady. Later, right now. Rourke's voice came through the earpiece, sharp. We have a problem. Vance's unit just moved up their timeline. They're staging now, not in 30 minutes. And a pause that carried weight. We've got a vehicle pulling into the north entrance. 2 vehicles. It's not law enforcement. Adrian turned the chair. Crow. Has to be. Someone tipped him that the DA unit was moving. Adrian looked at Elena. She looked back at him. The fluorescent light was unforgiving, and she had a bruise on her face, and her hair was half out of its tie, and she was looking at him with the steadiness she always had, the kind that cost something and that she paid without complaint. Can you run? He said. Yes. Stay with Rourke. Whatever he says, do it. He looked at Rourke. Get her to the south dock. The DA unit is coming in from the east. They'll be on the building in under 10 minutes. All you have to do is get her outside and keep her outside. And you? Rourke said. Adrian was already moving toward the door, toward the corridor that led north through the building. Crow is in one of those vehicles, he said. I'm going to go find out which one. Sir, that is not... Go, Rourke. He went north through the building, and the steel floor was back under his wheels, and the sound was exactly what he'd known it would be, a low metallic hum that announced him to anyone listening. And he made a decision in the space of 2 seconds to stop caring about that, because Crow's people were in the building now, and quiet had ceased to be an available option. He heard them before he saw them. Footsteps on the steel floor coming from the north entrance. 2 sets, moving fast. He pulled the cig, positioned himself in the shadow beside a refrigeration unit, and waited. The first man came through without looking left. Adrian let him pass. The second man was looking left, and their eyes met, and Adrian shot him in the shoulder before the man's own weapon cleared its holster. The first man spun, and Adrian fired twice and hit the wall because the angle was wrong from chair height, and the man got behind a refrigeration unit, and they were at an impasse in a dark corridor in a warehouse, while somewhere behind him, Rourke was moving Elena toward the south dock. He counted to 3 and moved. Not back. Forward, toward the man behind the refrigeration unit, directly at him, because the one thing people consistently failed to account for was how fast the chair moved when he was pushing it hard. And the man came around the corner of the unit expecting Adrian to be where he'd been, and instead found him 2 feet away, and the distance was wrong for the weapon, and Adrian hit him with the chair at full momentum, and the man went down against the concrete base of the unit and stayed down. He stopped, listened. More footsteps from the north entrance. More than 2 this time. He was deep in the building, too far from the south dock, and Crow's people were between him and the north exit, and Vance's unit was still minutes away, and the situation had clarified itself into something that required, again, a fundamental recalibration. He looked at his phone, called Marcus, who had stayed with the car per the extraction plan. North side, Adrian said. I need eyes. I've got eyes, Marcus said. There's a man outside the north entrance who hasn't gone in. Separate from the others, hanging back by the second vehicle. Description. My age. Good coat. Standing very still. Crow. Adrian put the phone in his pocket and looked at the corridor that led to the north entrance and thought about what Crow was doing standing outside while his men were inside. He was waiting. The way he always waited. Positioned at a remove from the violence, present enough to observe the outcome, far enough to maintain the option of plausible absence. He thought about 72 hours, about step away, about a phone call that had been designed to feel like a negotiation but was actually a sentence, delivered with the confidence of a man who believed there was no other option. He moved toward the north entrance. The 2 men who came at him in the connecting corridor, he managed one cleanly, took a hit on his left shoulder from the other before Petrov, who had apparently not gone to the south dock as instructed, but instead followed Adrian north because Petrov had never in 11 years followed an instruction he disagreed with, put the second man down from 10 feet away, and then looked at Adrian's shoulder with an expression of professional assessment. Through and through, Petrov said. Adrian checked. The jacket was torn. The shoulder burned with the specific deep burn of tissue damage, but his arm was still functional, which meant nothing structural had been compromised. Yes, he said. Good. Petrov reloaded with the calm efficiency of a man who had done it many times. You should have let me come with you. You're supposed to be at the South Dock. Rourke has the South Dock. Petrov looked down the corridor. Shall we? The north entrance was a personnel door beside the main rolling gate. Adrian hit it with his good shoulder, and it opened outward into the cold October night, and he went through it, and there was Crow. Damien Crow was 61 years old, and looked 61 in a way that suggested a life of controlled excess. Not a man who'd aged badly, but a man whose face had hardened into the specific set of someone who had spent decades making decisions that cost other people more than they cost him. He was in a charcoal overcoat. His hands were in his pockets. He looked at Adrian coming through the door in the wheelchair with a torn jacket and a shoulder that was bleeding through the fabric, and something moved across Crow's face. Not surprise, not quite, but something adjacent to it. He hadn't expected Adrian to come north. He'd expected Adrian to run south with the woman. Behind Crow, the driver of the second vehicle was reaching into his jacket. Petrov materialized through the door behind Adrian, and the driver went still. The four of them stood in the cold outside the north entrance of the warehouse, and somewhere to the east, Adrian could hear vehicles, the tactical unit, arriving on schedule into a situation that had already moved past the point where schedules mattered. You came yourself, Crow said, the same words Elena had said, and the same note of something almost like respect underneath them. Seems to be the night for it, Adrian said. Crow looked at him, at the chair, at the shoulder, at the gun that Adrian had not lowered. You look terrible, he said. You should see the other men. A moment of silence. The cold air between them. Somewhere inside the building, a shout. Vance's unit, breaching from the east, finding what they found. This is over, Adrian said. Vance has the documentation. Everything I gave her. Tonight you lose the financial structure, the shell network, 6 years of municipal corruption, and the man who coordinated the bridge. He paused. It's over, Damien. Crow's hands came out of his pockets. Empty. He looked at the night sky for a moment, briefly, the look of a man taking inventory of something. Then he looked at Adrian. You gave everything to Vance, he said. You understand what that means for you. Yes. Your organization. My organization will survive a restructuring. Adrian kept the gun level. His shoulder was screaming. He kept his face still. Yours won't survive what Vance is about to do to it. That's the difference. Crow looked at him for a long time. The tactical unit was louder now, voices carrying from the east side of the building. Crow's driver had his hands visible and was looking at Petrov with the calculation of a man running odds. You thought my weakness was Elena, Adrian said. You built an entire operation around that premise. 14 months of architecture. You turned people inside my house. You put men on a bridge. All of it because you found the one thing you thought would break me. He held Crow's gaze. You were wrong about what it meant. I was right that she mattered, Crow said. Yes, you were right about that. Adrian lowered the gun. Not all the way, just enough. She matters because she's the only thing I've ever protected for the right reasons. Not leverage, not strategy, not because of what it cost or what it bought. He paused. You don't understand that. You never have. That's why you lost. Crow's jaw worked once. His eyes moved to the east side of the building, where the lights of the tactical unit were visible now through the warehouse's high windows. You're going to let me walk, Crow said, and let Vance clean it up. Vance is going to find you within 72 hours, regardless of where you walk to, Adrian said. The documentation I gave her is that complete. He paused. But yes, I'm going to let Vance do her job. Crow looked at him for a long, final moment, the look of a man who has run the calculation and found that the numbers no longer work in his favor, who is old enough and experienced enough to know what that means and to meet it without theater. The girl, Crow said. She's all right? She's fine. Good. He said it like he meant it, which was the most disorienting thing about the entire night. For what it's worth, that part wasn't the plan. The man who marked her face is going to have a conversation with me about restraint. He's going to have a longer conversation with Vance's people, Adrian said. They're currently finding him in the East Corridor. Crow nodded, turned, walked to the vehicle. Adrian watched him go and did not stop him, and Petrov looked at Adrian with the expression of a man who had several opinions about this decision and was choosing not to voice them. And Adrian lowered the gun fully and became aware all at once of his shoulder, his hands, the cold, and the specific exhaustion that settles into a body after sustained adrenaline has finished its work and left the invoice behind. His phone buzzed. Rourke. "She's out," Rourke said. "South Dock. She's fine. She's asking about you." He looked at the empty space where Crow's vehicle had been, the night air coming off the port, the distant sound of Vance's unit, moving through the building, finding what he'd left them to find. "Tell her I'm coming," he said. He turned the chair south and pushed, and the cold night air came in against his face, and his shoulder burned, and somewhere on the south side of the building, Elena Whitmore was standing in the dark waiting for him, and he moved toward her the way he'd been moving toward her. He understood now. Since the first Tuesday morning, he walked into a flower shop and saw a woman give a stranger something for nothing, and felt something shift in the architecture of who he was, forward, and with everything he had, and without the faintest intention of stopping. The South Dock came into view. Elena was standing at the edge of the loading dock with Rourke 2 steps behind her, and her arms crossed against the cold, and the bruise on her cheek, and her eyes on the darkness between the buildings, until they found him, and when they did, she exhaled, one long, visible breath that condensed in the cold air and disappeared. And she came down the dock steps toward him without running, the way she did everything, deliberately, with her whole self and without apology. She stopped in front of him. He stopped the chair. She looked at his shoulder, at the blood on the jacket. Her jaw tightened and her eyes went somewhere briefly that he recognized as the place people go when they are absorbing something that frightened them after the fear is technically over. "How bad?" she said. "Through and through. I'll live." "You will," she agreed. The firmness in her voice left no room for alternative outcomes. From the east side of the warehouse, they could hear Vance's unit completing its sweep. Voices calling clear, the particular organized sound of a professional operation finding its footing in a space that had already been cleared by people with different methods. In the distance, the first siren, backup or medical, or both. Rourke materialized at Adrian's shoulder. "We need to move before Vance's people come around the south side and start asking who we are." "Go," Adrian said. To Elena, "Can you walk?" "I've been able to walk this entire time," she said. The faint dry edge in her voice, the one she deployed when she was both exhausted and mildly exasperated, was the most beautiful thing he'd heard all night. "Then stay close," he said. They moved, and somewhere to the north, in a charcoal overcoat, Damian Crow was driving toward a future that had just become dramatically shorter, and he knew it, and Adrian knew it, and the documentation sitting in Petra Vance's locked office was going to make sure that the knowing was followed, very soon, by the consequence. But that was the next 72 hours. Right now there was the cold air and the dark between the warehouses, and Elena's hand coming to rest on his shoulder. The good one, not the bleeding one, because she paid attention, she always paid attention. As they moved toward the car, and Adrian Voss put his hand over hers and kept moving, and did not stop and did not look back. The hospital was a private facility on the north end of the city, the kind that had no signage visible from the street and accepted payment through channels that didn't generate paperwork. Adrian had used it twice before, once for Rourke, after Lion, once for a man named Delgado who had taken 3 rounds in an operation in Baltimore and who now ran the Voss organization's southern operations from an office in Charleston and sent Adrian a bottle of decent whiskey every Christmas without fail. The facility was clean, discreet, and staffed by people who had learned, through employment, to be incurious about the circumstances that delivered patients to their door. The surgeon who worked on Adrian's shoulder was a woman named Dr. Osi, 43, with close-cropped hair and the particular economy of movement that came from years of doing precise work in confined spaces. She didn't speak much. She cleaned the wound, confirmed the assessment, through and through, no structural damage to the joint, significant soft tissue trauma that was going to make the next 2 weeks unpleasant, and closed it with the efficiency of someone whose relationship to pain was purely functional. Elena sat in the corridor outside. Adrian knew she was there because she'd refused to go to the waiting room, which was down one floor and around a corner, and he'd been able to hear, at intervals, the sound of her moving in the chair outside the door. The specific restless sound of a person who needs to be doing something and has been denied the option. When Dr. Osei finished and left, Elena came in. She sat in the chair beside the treatment table and looked at his shoulder, bandaged now, the arm in a temporary sling, and then at his face, and she did her inventory the way she always did it, the quiet, thorough assessment of someone who needs to confirm the actual state of things before they can let themselves feel anything about it. "You need to stop getting shot," she said. "It's the first time." "I'm aware it's the first time. That's why I'm saying stop before it becomes a pattern." She reached out and touched the edge of the bandage very lightly, the way you test the temperature of something. Then she sat back. The bruise on her cheekbone had deepened to a full purple blue and would get worse before it got better. "How's the pain?" "Manageable. The doctor said you refused the stronger painkiller." "The stronger painkiller affects cognitive function. I have things to finish tonight." Elena looked at him. The look lasted long enough that he felt it as a physical thing, a specific weight. "Adrian," she said. "What things?" He told her about Vance, about the documentation, about the call he'd made to Vance from the car on the way to the facility, confirming that Crow had been at the north entrance, confirming what had been said, confirming that Crow was in a vehicle heading somewhere, and that Vance's people needed to find that vehicle before he had time to start dismantling what the documentation would reveal. Vance had not been pleased about the unauthorized entry into the building. She'd been significantly more pleased about the 4 men her unit had taken into custody inside, including the driver of the car that had intercepted Elena's route that morning, and including Hewson, who had been found in a back office attempting to destroy a laptop and who had, upon being informed of the breadth of documentation already in Vance's possession, experienced a rapid philosophical conversion toward cooperation. "Crow," Elena said. "What happens to Crow?" "Vance will have him within 48 hours. The documentation makes the financial charges airtight. That's the kind of thing that doesn't depend on witness testimony, doesn't collapse when people get nervous. It's numbers and accounts and a paper trail that he was too confident to fully erase." He paused. "She'll get him. And your organization." He looked at her steadily. "That's a longer conversation." "I have time." "You have a bruise on your face and you've been in a warehouse for 8 hours. You should sleep." "I'll sleep when you tell me about your organization." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. "Restructuring," he said. "Vance and I discussed parameters. What I gave her targets Crow, his network, his people, his financial infrastructure. My organization's exposure is limited to what intersects with his operations. There are things that will need to change," he paused. "Things I've been planning to change for a while. The timeline is simply accelerated now." Elena held his gaze. "How much change?" "Enough that it won't be what it was." He said it straight. "Some of it I'm required to do as part of what I agreed with Vance. Some of it I've wanted to do for a long time and had constructed reasons to postpone." He looked at his hands, his good hand resting in his lap, and the other one immobilized at his side. "Some of the things I've run, Elena, I'm not going to pretend they were things I'd defend to you. I won't do that." She was quiet for a moment. The facility hummed around them, the contained institutional sound of a building doing its careful work. "I'm not asking you to defend them," she said finally. "I'm asking what comes next." "Something different," he said. "Smaller, cleaner. The parts of the operation that have always been legitimate, and there are more of those than people assume, those stay. The rest gets dismantled on a timeline Vance and I agreed on." He met her eyes. "It's going to take time. It's not going to be clean. There are people whose livelihoods are tied up in this, and I have obligations to them that don't disappear because the structure changes." She nodded. She was listening the way she always listened, with the slight leftward tilt of her head, taking it in fully. "And the people who betrayed you," she said. "Mrs. Galen, Carver." "Mrs. Galen's daughter's debt is cleared. I handled it this afternoon." He said it without drama. The debt was the leverage. Without the leverage, what Crow had on her disappears. She'll be remanded to Vance's process. She gave information that contributed to the ambush. That has a consequence I can't and won't prevent. But her daughter is safe. And Carver. Carver is more complicated. He thought about Ruth. 6 years old, a photograph, a father who had taken a bullet in Lyon, and then 8 months ago looked at a picture of his daughter and made a decision that he would have to live with. He cooperated fully. He gave us everything. The information he provided tonight was what allowed us to get to you. He paused. I don't forgive it. I don't think forgiveness is mine to give, frankly. The men who died on the bridge, that's not something I have standing to forgive on their behalf. But Carver is going to have the opportunity to do something useful with what comes next, if he chooses to. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then, you've been planning all of this since Crow called this afternoon. In your head, while you were talking to Vance, while you were coming into the building, there's a lot of time to think in a warehouse corridor, he said. She made a short sound, not quite a laugh, not one. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth, the gesture he'd catalogued months ago as the one she made when she was absorbing something that moved her and didn't want to perform the being moved. Then she dropped her hand and looked at him straight. I want to go back to the estate, she said, tonight. I don't want to go to a safe house or another facility. I want to go to the estate and I want to sleep in an actual bed, and tomorrow I want coffee that is better than what you make, which I am going to make myself, and then I want to sit somewhere with sunlight and figure out what happens next. He looked at her. Crow isn't contained yet. I know. It's not fully safe. I know. She held his gaze. I also know that I've been afraid today. I've been sitting in that room for 8 hours being afraid and waiting, and I am done letting that determine where I go and what I do. She paused. Take me back to the estate, Adrian. He thought about arguing. He decided against it. Rourke, he said, raising his voice toward the door. Rourke opened the door immediately, which confirmed that he'd been 2 feet from it the entire time. Sir? We're going back to the estate. Full security posture, rotating perimeter, no interior staff beyond the night team until Crow is in custody. He looked at Rourke. And someone needs to clean the ash out of the study fireplace. Rourke's expression did the thing it occasionally did, in moments of sustained crisis that resolved into domesticity. I'll see to it, he said. They went back to the estate. The night team had the grounds lit and secured, and the mansion itself had that specific quality it sometimes had after difficult nights. A kind of held-breath stillness, every room aware that something had happened and waiting to find out what the aftermath looked like. Elena walked through the entrance hall and stopped in the middle of it and looked at the ceiling and breathed one long breath, and Adrian watched her do it and thought about what it cost to be the kind of person she was. The kind who breathed deliberately in the aftermath of things, who chose steadiness not because it came naturally, but because she had decided, somewhere along the way, that it was worth the effort. She went upstairs to the guest room. He heard her moving above him, the specific sound of a person settling in, the water running, the eventual quiet. He stayed in the study. The fire had been remade, Rourke, or the night team, and the ash was gone and the new fire was burning cleanly, and the white lilies on the side table had opened fully in the warmth. He sat in front of the fire with his good hand in his lap, and his shoulder throbbing at a frequency he'd calibrated into background noise, and he let himself feel, very briefly, the weight of the last 24 hours. 3 things had ended tonight. The version of himself that had believed isolation was protection had ended on a dock in the warehouse district with Elena's hand on his good shoulder and her breath visible in the cold air. The 14 months of Crow's architecture had ended in a parking lot outside a warehouse, in a conversation between 2 men who had known each other long enough to skip the performance. And the version of his life that had been running on the premise that it could continue unchanged indefinitely. That version had ended in a hospital room, in a conversation about restructuring, which was a clean word for a messy and necessary thing. He picked up his phone, looked at the time, 2:47 in the morning. He called Vance. She answered on the second ring, which told him she hadn't slept. Voss. Crow. Still looking. He's not at any of the properties in the documentation. Either he has locations that aren't in what you gave me, or he's moving. A pause. He'll make a mistake. They always do when they're running. He's not going to run far, Adrian said. Crow doesn't run. He repositions. He's finding a new angle. Then we find him before he finds the angle. Vance's voice was tired, but had the quality of a woman who ran on something other than sleep. The Houston cooperation is significant. He's giving us names that weren't in your documentation. The picture is getting complete. How long? 48 hours, maybe less. A brief pause. The woman, Ms. Whitmore. She's all right? She's at the estate. She should have a statement taken tomorrow, he said. She'll give you whatever you need tomorrow. A silence. Then Vance said in a different register, not the professional register, something underneath it. You know what tonight means for your operation? We discussed the parameters. The parameters are going to require active cooperation over the next several months, not a one-time document transfer, active, ongoing cooperation. She paused. I need to know that's going to hold. It's going to hold, he said. I gave you my word this afternoon. That's not conditional on outcomes. Another silence. The fire popped. Get some sleep, Voss. You've been shot. I'm aware. 48 hours, she said, and hung up. He sat with the dead phone and the fire and the lilies and the quiet of the house for another hour. At some point, the shoulder broke through the background noise and became insistent, and he took the mild painkiller that Dr. Ose had sent and that he'd been refusing since the facility because the mild one was a different calculation. The mild one left him functional, just slower at the edges, and slower at the edges was survivable now that the night's work was done. He fell asleep in the wheelchair in front of the fire. He woke to the smell of coffee. Daylight, actual daylight, the thin October kind that came in low and pale through the study windows and did what it could with the room. The fire was out. The lilies had held. His shoulder had moved from acute to chronic, which was a shift in the right direction. He was stiff in the way that sleeping in a chair produced, the specific accumulated stiffness of a body that had spent the night compensating for an inadequate surface. Elena was sitting across from him with 2 cups, and she handed him one, and he took it. It was genuinely good coffee. You made this, he said. I told you I would. He drank it. She drank hers. The study sat around them in the morning light, different from how it had been the night before in ways that were hard to articulate but were real. The ash was gone. The lilies were open. The bourbon glass had been cleared at some point by someone. The room looked like a room where a person lived, rather than a room where a person retreated. The bruise, he said. She touched her cheek briefly. I know, it's impressive. Does it hurt? Everything hurts, I'm fine. She looked at him over her cup. How's the shoulder? Everything hurts, I'm fine. She smiled, a small one, the real kind that started at the corner of her mouth before her eyes caught up with it. He had cataloged that smile during 14 months of Tuesday mornings, and he had not gotten less interested in it during the 6 months he'd spent trying to pretend he'd never seen it. I need to open the shop today, she said. Elena, Crow isn't in custody yet, I know. I'll have one of Rourke's people with me. She said it simply, not as a negotiation. The shop has been closed for 3 days. I have orders. I have flowers that are going to be dead by tomorrow if I don't deal with them today. She looked at him. I'm not going to live in suspension until the world arranges itself into perfect safety, Adrian. That's not a life. He looked at her. She was right. She was usually right about the things that mattered, which was something he'd spent considerable energy resisting before he'd accepted it as simply a fact about her. The way certain facts about terrain are just facts. This is how the ground lies. Work with it. Rourke goes with you, he said. Rourke will hate that. Rourke will do his job. I know, I just mean he'll hate it. She looked into her cup. After Crow is dealt with, she stopped. Started again. After it's over. The restructuring you were talking about. What does that look like, practically? For you. Day to day. He considered the question. It deserved a real answer, not a managed one. Smaller, he said. The legitimate holdings, the real estate, the import business, 2 of the security firms, those have always been clean. I build around those. The other parts get wound down on Vance's timeline, which gives me approximately 8 months to do it responsibly. He paused. 8 months is enough time to ensure that the people who depend on the current structure have somewhere to land. And then I run a real estate operation and 2 security firms and have significantly more time to sit in front of fires. Elena looked at him. The morning light was doing something to the room, making it feel possible, he thought, which was a quality he hadn't associated with this room in a long time, maybe ever. "You're not going to be bored," she said carefully. Not a question. Probably not immediately. Because bored is... I'm aware of what bored is for men in my position, he said. I've watched it happen to other people. I don't intend to be a case study. She nodded, looked at the window, then back at him. I want to keep the shop, she said. I know it's small compared to... I've never thought it was small, he said. He said it simply because it was simple. Because the flower shop on Hartley Street had been the place where he'd spent 14 months being, without ceremony or strategy, the closest thing to himself he'd managed to become. I've never once thought that. She looked at him for a moment. Then she put her cup down on the side table next to the lilies, and she looked at her hands in her lap and said, without looking up, "When you were in that building last night, coming north instead of south." She paused. "I knew you were going to do it. When Rourke was moving me to the dock and you said go, I knew you weren't going south. I knew because..." She stopped. Because you're the kind of person who goes north." She finally looked up. "And I need you to know that I know that about you, and that I'm not going to spend the next however many years asking you to be different, because that's not what I want. I want the person who actually exists." Her jaw worked slightly. "But I also need you to know that the next time you take a bullet, I am going to be significantly less composed about it." He looked at her. He thought about the Tuesday mornings, the white lily every week for his sister, Mara, who had died at 31 of something fast and brutal, and who had been in the private accounting of his life, the last person he'd loved without protection, the last one he'd let all the way in before he'd built the architecture of distance and called it strength. He brought her the lily every week, not because it changed anything, but because she had deserved better than what the world gave her, and the lily was the only argument he could still make on her behalf. He thought about standing outside the flower shop on Hartley Street and watching Elena give a stranger something for nothing, and the shift he'd felt in his chest that he'd had no vocabulary for, and the vocabulary he had for it now, it was recognition. The recognition of one person seeing, in another person, a capacity for love that didn't ask for reciprocation, that just acted, that just gave, that just showed up in the rain and stood at the gate and refused to leave. "I'm not easy to be with," he said. It came out rougher than he intended. "I know that." "I'm aware," she said, the dry edge again. Then, softer. "You're also not what you think you are." "What do I think I am?" "You think you're a burden." She said it straight, without armor. "You think the chair, and everything that comes with it, is something that has to be tolerated by the people around you. You think love is something you have to earn back every day because what you have to offer now is less than what you used to have to offer." She held his gaze. "You're wrong. And I know you're wrong intellectually. I'm saying I need you to be wrong about it the rest of the way down, in the part that doesn't respond to arguments." He was quiet. The fire was out. The morning light came in steady and pale and made everything in the room look like itself. "That's going to take time," he said finally. "I have time," she said. "That's what I'm telling you." 41 hours after that conversation, at 11:17 on a Saturday morning, Petra Vance called Adrian's phone. He was in the garden, the East Garden, where the late-season roses were doing their stubborn October best against the cold, where the paths were paved and level, and he could move without difficulty. Elena was inside on the phone with her assistant about the shop. He'd been sitting in the garden listening to the sound of the estate in daylight, which was different from the sound of it at night, in ways he'd started to notice again after months of not caring enough to listen. He answered on the first ring. "We have him," Vance said. She didn't elaborate immediately. He waited. "He tried to cross into Maryland late last night. We had a flag on every crossing in a 4-state radius. He was in a vehicle registered to a company that wasn't in your documentation. He had one layer we hadn't found yet. A pause that contained professional satisfaction held at careful distance. But he made the crossing at 3 in the morning, which is the kind of decision men make when they're tired and running and starting to believe they've slipped the net. He hadn't slipped the net. Adrian looked at the late roses, their specific October stubbornness. And the charges. Financial conspiracy, racketeering, 3 counts related to the bridge. We're still building those, but Hewson gave us the logistics man, who gave us enough for the DA's office to move forward. Vance paused. He's not getting out, Voss. I want you to know that clearly. This isn't going to be one of those situations where the architecture collapses at trial. What you gave me is too complete. He sat with that for a moment. 14 months of Crow's architecture, the bridge, 3 men who went home in boxes, the wheelchair, the neurosurgeon's voice, the word permanent. Mrs. Galen's hands in her lap in the study, her daughter in Portland. Carver's daughter Ruth, 6 years old, a photograph used as a weapon. Elena standing in a fluorescent-lit warehouse room arguing with a man she'd never met about the nature of her own irrelevance. All of it, Crow's work. All of it run on the premise that the right target, applied with sufficient precision, would produce the desired collapse. He'd been wrong about what would collapse and what wouldn't. Thank you, Adrian said. He meant it without ceremony. Don't thank me yet, Vance said. We have 8 months of cooperation ahead of us. I'll be in touch Monday about the first round of documentation requirements. A pause. And Voss, for what it's worth, what you did Friday night, coming into that building, I'm going to professionally pretend I don't know about it. But personally. A brief silence. She's a good woman. Yes, Adrian said. She is. He put the phone in his lap and looked at the garden. He sat there for a while. Long enough for the cold to settle into his hands and the angle of the light to shift, the sun moving in its October arc, doing its low pale work on the gardens and the stone paths, and the late roses that hadn't yet decided to give up for the year. He heard the door to the garden open. Elena came out in a coat, a different one, not the green one from the night of the storm. She was carrying 2 cups. She crossed the garden to where he was, handed him one, and sat on the stone bench beside him. Vance, he said, I heard. She'd been near the door, he realized, not eavesdropping, just near. It's done. It's done. She looked at the roses. He looked at the roses. The coffee was hot in his hands and his shoulder had downgraded from chronic to the specific manageable ache of something healing on its own terms, at its own pace, which was the only pace available to it. My sister's name was Mara, he said. Elena turned to look at him. She died when she was 31, 11 years ago. He looked at the garden. I bought the white lily every Tuesday because she loved them, because she used to... He stopped, started again. Because she deserved the gesture even when she was no longer there to receive it. Elena was quiet, not uncomfortably. She had the capacity for silence that certain people develop, the kind that makes room rather than demanding to be filled. I chose your shop, he said, because I saw you give a flower to a stranger who couldn't pay for it. And I thought... He paused. I thought Mara would have liked you. She had the same instinct. The same thing where kindness was just the default rather than a performance. Elena looked at her coffee, then at him. Her eyes were doing something that he'd learned to read as emotion being held carefully. Not suppressed, just held. I'm sorry about Mara, she said. I know. What was she like? He looked at the roses. He thought about Mara. Her laugh, the specific kind she had that required her whole body. The way she'd argued with him about everything growing up, not because she disagreed with him on everything, but because she believed that arguments kept people sharp. The way she'd looked at him in the hospital at the end, when the thing was moving fast and there was nothing to be done about that. And she'd said, You're allowed to love people. Adrian, it's not a strategic error. He'd held that sentence for 11 years and let it cost him very little, and now, in a garden in October with a woman who had stood at his gate in the rain for 2 hours, he understood that she'd been right in a way he was only beginning to be able to use. She would have had opinions, he said, about all of this. She would have told me what I was doing wrong about 6 months earlier than I figured it out. Smart woman, Elena said. She was. They sat together in the garden while the morning moved and the light shifted and the October cold did what it did. Not harsh, just present, the kind of cold that defined the edges of things. At some point, Elena's shoulder came to rest against his, and he didn't move away from it, and she didn't make anything of it. And they sat in that contact the way people do when they have been through something together, and the something is over, and what remains is each other, and a garden, and 2 cups of coffee. 3 months later, Damian Crowe was formally indicted on 19 counts. The trial date was set for the following spring. Hewson cooperated fully and received a reduced sentence that Vance described, in a phone call to Adrian, as more lenient than he deserved, but less lenient than his lawyers had hoped for, which she considered an acceptable outcome. Mrs. Galen's case moved through the system slowly, the way cases involving elderly defendants with no prior record and demonstrable coercion tended to move. Adrian provided a written statement to Vance's office that laid out the leverage Crowe had held over her. He did not advocate for a specific outcome. He stated the facts and let them weigh what they weighed. Her daughter remained in Portland, safe, the debt fully cleared. Carver left the organization in November. He took a position with one of the legitimate security firms, the one that operated entirely above ground and contracted with corporations that had nothing to do with anything that would require a man to choose between his daughter and his integrity. Adrian did not see him before he left. He sent a brief message through Rourke that said, "Ruth's college fund is in an account in her name. The details are with your attorney." Carver did not respond in words. Rourke told Adrian, 2 weeks later, that Carver had sent a photograph. Ruth, on a swing, midair, laughing. Adrian had Rourke print it and put it on the desk in the study. He wasn't sure why, exactly. He thought maybe Mara would have understood. The restructuring took the full 8 months. Vance's cooperation requirements were exacting and regular and occasionally infuriating, and Adrian honored every one of them without exception, which Vance acknowledged near the end of the 8th month, with a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and contained more personal warmth than their entire prior interaction combined. The organization that remained at the end was smaller and cleaner and ran on principles that he could have defended, if pressed, to someone whose opinion he respected. He found that this bothered him less than he'd expected and satisfied him more. Hartley Street Flowers reopened the week after the warehouse, with Rourke present for 3 days before Elena told him his presence was making the customers nervous and sent him back to the estate. The bruise on her cheek faded over 2 weeks into nothing visible, though she'd wake occasionally in the first month with a specific tension in her jaw that she didn't always explain and that Adrian didn't always ask about, because some things healed on their own schedule and needed space more than conversation. The Tuesday visits resumed. Different now. He drove himself, in a car with hand controls that he'd been resistant to for months, and had finally accepted because Elena had said, with the particular directness she used when she'd decided something, "The car with hand controls means you don't have to wait for someone to drive you. That seems like something you'd want." She'd been right. She was usually right. He was getting better at not being surprised by that. He'd bring the lily. She'd be there, or she'd be in the back with the flowers, and he'd wait, and eventually she'd come out, and they'd have 5 minutes or 20 minutes of conversation over the counter, and she'd look at him with that direct, uncomplicated steadiness, and he'd look back, and the Tuesday morning would be what it had always been at its core. One person choosing, deliberately, to be present with another person, and the other person choosing the same thing back. In March, Adrian went to his sister's grave. It was a cold day, one of the last real cold days before the year began to turn. The cemetery was quiet. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning, the kind of time when most people were at work, and the grounds were left to whoever had decided that this particular Tuesday was the right one. He brought the white lily. He sat beside the grave for a while and looked at Mara's name in the stone and thought about the 11 years since she'd died, and what they had contained and what they might still contain, and the specific difference between the man who had sat by this grave for years carrying his loss like a private tax, and the man who was sitting here now, which was a difference he couldn't fully articulate but could feel in the way a healed bone feels different from an unbroken one. Not weaker, different, something that had been through something and had its own record of that. "I think you would have been right," he said, to the stone, to Mara, to whatever version of her existed in the 11 years of conversations he'd held with her absence. "About the strategic error. He paused. You usually were. The wind moved through the cemetery, the cold, clear March wind carrying the first real suggestion of something else behind it. He placed the lily at the base of the stone. He stayed for a while. Then he turned the chair and moved back along the path through the cemetery, toward the gate where he'd parked, where the drive back to the city was 40 minutes, and the morning was still young enough that he could stop at Hartley Street before the Tuesday rush made parking difficult. Elena was trimming stems when he came in. She looked up. She saw his face, whatever was in it, from the cemetery, and she held it in her gaze for a moment, long enough to understand it, and then she nodded once. The small, deliberate nod she used when words would be too much, and acknowledgement was what was needed. He moved to the counter. She set down the stems. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, straight on, without armor, without calculation, with the specific quality of attention that said, I see what's actually here, and I'm staying anyway. Coffee, she said. I made good coffee today. You always make good coffee. I know. I like hearing you say it. She reached for the cup she'd had waiting. She'd known he was coming. It was Tuesday, she always knew. And she put it on the counter in front of him. Then she leaned on the counter with both forearms and looked at him in the morning light coming through the shop windows. The same light that had been coming through these windows for 14 months of Tuesdays. And she said, How was she? He wrapped his hands around the cup. Herself, he said. Same as always. Elena nodded. She reached across the counter and covered one of his hands with hers, briefly, warmly, the way she touched things she was certain of. Then she went back to her stems and he drank his coffee, and the shop moved around them in its quiet Tuesday way, and outside on Hartley Street the city went about its necessary business, and the morning held them both.